All right, so how you doing, everyone? This is Gus, the vicious beast. You heard in the prior video. He's barking, causing a disturbance. But he's our little class mascot now that we're all stuck here at home. So I'll let the old man down. But so okay. Um, I think seeing an animal is a nice little break from coronavirus, right? So anyway, we are going to press ahead and we're going to talk about the next topic here, which is exceptions. So, exceptions are a way of dealing with errors. And this is one of those things that is so an extraordinarily helpful piece of functionality that is present in Java, as well as a bunch of other languages, that is not available in C. And it helps an awful lot with this is all about basically being able to handle errors that come up while the program's running. So this is what we really refer to as runtime errors, right? There's different types of errors that you've experienced when you're programming. They could be everything from compile time errors, right, which is basically the compiler's yelling at you and saying, hey, you can't even execute this. You can have bugs like logic errors where things run fine, but like there's nothing's crashing on you, but there's something not working quite right. So you have those kind of logic errors. And then you can have runtime errors, which is when something happens and causes the program to crash or experience a major problem while the program is running, which is a little bit different than a runtime error. I mean, a logic error or a traditional bug. In which the fact that you can have the program could crash on you or could basically be in a situation where it can no longer run. Okay, where am I going with this? Is the idea here is it's really bad if a program just crashes, right? Everybody's experienced this. You've been using a piece of software and you had the thing freeze up on you or crash and it's a kind of a miserable thing, right? You're working on something, you're doing something and the thing crashes on you. Exceptionally frustrating. And what we would much rather have is to deal with problems in what kind of a graceful way. So a problem occurs, and we handle it in a way in which we're going to say, "Oh, okay, a problem happened. Let's try to maybe log the problem, have some message or something, and then have some logic that handles the problem in a way without kind of crashing the program." Sometimes this happens all behind the scenes. The user of a piece of software doesn't even know that the problem occurred because it's kind of handled in a way to try to recover from it. So anyway, let's look at this. Let's look at an example. And what I think makes a good example here is to take a look in particular. Let's take a look at a reading a file because we saw this in C when we were reading a file, and we did this quite a bit where we were saying, hey, if you're reading a file, you got to have some sort of error checking. And an extremely common error is runtime error, is that you're running some code and you need to read some information in, like from a file, and the file's not there, or maybe it's formatted incorrectly, or there's all sorts of problems associated with reading from the file. So we want to handle that, and we want to check if we're able to read the thing successfully. So I've got this file here. It's a list of some student names. Okay, and let's look at how we can do some error handling in Java. And we're going to see this actually looks quite a bit different than the options that were available to us in the C language. Okay. So first and foremost, let's do the following, right? Let's look at some logic to how we can read in a file in Java. And I'm not going to get too bogged down into this because I really want to focus mostly on exceptions and the way of error handling rather than actually be so focused on being able to talk about how files are handled in Java. It's actually fairly straightforward. So we're creating a file object of type from the file class. It's very common, by the way, for the name of the class to have a capital letter and the object to start with a lowercase letter. Proper conventions, right? Very common to see things that way. Okay. And I'm going to use something in this case called scanner. that's going to allow, we actually saw this from reading data from the user. We're doing something very similar here, except we're not going to read it from the user, right? We're going to read it from a file. So we're using this same scanner class, right? But now notice I'm using the scanner constructor, right? Scanner constructor, and I'm using it passing in that file that we created, that file object we created in the previous line. Okay, what this is effectively doing is we're constructing a scanner object, and now we're constructing it in such a way as saying, hey, the input is coming from this file, right? It's coming from this file. It's not coming from the user's like keyboard input. Okay. Now these IDEs very helpful. I got to import a couple libraries, and I can actually just click here and say, oh, yep, I need to import the Java utility scanner library. We need that. Okay. And one thing is, this is a little bit of a clue of where we're going. Is this says here, right? Notice I'm not able to compile this, right? I'm not able to build this currently. And it says unreported exception, file not found exception, must be caught or declared to be thrown. Okay. Now, right now, I would expect that you have no idea what that really means, except for having gone through Zybooks and maybe and getting it from that perspective. But we haven't talked about it yet, and we haven't really practiced this. So we need to kind of get deeper into, we're going to kind of pull that apart of what that's talking about. But give me a moment. Let me get back to that. I'm going to temporarily ignore that error. Let's just look at some of the logic for being able to read from a file first. You know what? Actually, I take that back. We're going to have some logic to read from the file. But let's address this error right now, okay? And there's more than one way to do this. I'm going to show you one way. I'll show you one right now, okay? So it says unreported exception, file not found exception, must be caught or declared to be thrown. So let me talk about what it means by must be caught first. Or is one of the two options for handling this, okay? Let's talk about how we catch exceptions. So effectively what we have is I'm going to show you something which is called a try catch block. Okay. And what we're going to do, this is actually quite an elegant way of handling errors, and a bunch of languages do this. Let's look at this, okay? And notice, so I've got this thing here. What we're effectively doing is, notice everything in this try code block. What that does is we're effectively saying, hey, try to run this block of code, okay? Try to run this block of code. If an error comes up, okay, if an error comes up, a runtime error that would have basically crashed the program if we didn't do something, right? If an error comes up, we're going to catch that error, okay, and we're going to try to do this, but if we fail, we're going to catch the error here, and this is how we're going to try to gracefully handle the error, okay? Now, there's different types of errors. This one's called a file not found exception, right? Exception's kind of like another word for an error, right? It's some exceptional circumstance happens, something exception to the normal rule, and I actually also need to import a library for that. java.io.filenotfoundException gives me access to that class, okay, and then I built an object of that type, which I just kind of named for file not found exception. I named FNFE, okay. Now, what that's going to do is I'm going to try to do this here, okay. If the file not found error comes up, it's going to run this code block down here, okay? And then I can put whatever rule I want to handle that exception. So it might be, like a kind of simple way to do it is to say, hey, error, file not found, and then maybe we return, okay? That's very, very similar to what we've seen in prior like we saw doing in examples in C. I could also add some things here, like I could look at this exception, and if I do dot, right, there's all sorts of options in here, right? I could do things, You know, like you can print the stack trace. What that really is it prints like, hey, where did this get called? How did this get called? Right? There's all sorts of useful information that you can kind of dump to the screen if you wanted. But I'm going to leave it simple. I just want to leave the kind of basics, thus far. We're just going to go ahead and we're going to catch that error, okay, if it happens. And what we're going to do is we're just going to display something saying, hey, the file's not found. And then we're going to return. We're just going to quit, okay. And right now, I have this file in the current working directory of this application, right? Let me do one that's like that I'm going to call does not exist. Okay, does not exist. So what we're gonna let's trace this, right? I'm going to put a breakpoint. There, we'll do it here. There we go. I'm going to put a breakpoint here. Let's run this in debug mode. Okay, and let's kind of step through this. I'm going to step through, right? So step over. Okay, I create this file object. That's actually not where the error occurs, right? And then in the scanner, when I try to initialize that, okay, notice at that point, it goes here. It said that failed. This line 16 failed, and it ended up in the catch block. And then we can display our error, and we can leave and quit. Okay, so we can display our error and quit. Now, let me expand this try block here because I want to indicate something is that it does not complete the try block. As soon as an error occurs, it immediately leaves the try code block and catches the error. So let's expand this try block a little bit, and let's just basically try to read the entire file. Okay, so how we're going to read the file, there's many ways we could do this. I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but I'm going to use something. We're going to say has next line. Okay, this is kind of similar to what we saw with the file, like end of file, right? Logic that we saw in C. It's like, hey, are we at the end of the file yet? This is actually a little bit easier to use because what this is doing is saying, hey, is there an additional line to read in the file? Okay, do I have at least one more to read? Okay, it's very helpful. It makes things, the logic easier to write. And I'm going to read one line at a time. Okay, notice I could do this. I do dot. I could see all the different options available. I'm going to say next line. Okay. And I'm just going to print. What I want to do, I just want to dump every line of the file. Okay. That's what I want to do. All right. I want to dump every line in the file. Okay. I might even say something like this, just to make it clear what's coming from the file. Okay, so now this is actually never going to execute right now because the file doesn't exist that we're trying to read in. So the moment I'll run through this so we can actually see it, but the moment that error happens, we're gonna fall down in this catch block. All right, so let me run this in debug mode again just to kind of illustrate that underlying concept. Okay, and notice, right? I hit line 16. Right? There's gonna be an error or an exception is going to be thrown at this line. Okay, and notice, right? I went from line 16 all the way to line 24. Okay, an error happened, an exception happened. It said okay, right? We want to deal with that error, right? We're gonna say file not found, and we're gonna have whatever logic we want down here to handle that. Okay, which is very simple how we're handling it right now. We're basically quitting. Okay, that's the kind of some of the fundamentals of the looking at what we see as these try catch blocks. Okay, now I want to illustrate something is you can have different types of errors, right? File not found exceptions is just one type of error, right? If you wanted to handle any error that came up, right, you could use something called exception. Okay. So notice I can actually have multiple catch blocks down here. Okay. And the one down here, this is the kind of catch-all. This is any type of error that could come up. Okay? So this is like just trying to capture everything. So this is in a sense, this is a specific error. This is if anything happened. Okay? Any exception, any error that occurred up in this try. Okay? So it will, if the file not found exception occurred, it's going to land here, right? If any other error happens, it's going to land there, right? And the order matters, right? Because I put this one first, it's going to try to catch that one first, right, for this error, right? And then if it's anything else, it's going to catch it here. Okay, so you have different types of errors, right? Different types of exceptions, and you can have different rules of how you want to handle those exceptions based on the type of error that occurred. Okay. All right. So let me expand on this a little bit. Okay. What we're seeing so far is these kind of try-catch blocks. Okay. And let me run it, just kind of illustrate. Like right now, we know what's going to happen. We already saw that. If I did this, if I said students, right, then that won't happen, right? We're not going to land into these errors. It's going to run successfully. So let me run that, right, just to kind of show. Okay, here what we're seeing, displayed everything in the file, right, because this file exists. The error never occurred. In that case, it never ran. It never landed in these. Okay. Okay. So let's take this a little bit further. We could also define our own. We can also throw errors if we'd like. Okay. So in a sense, we can actually indicate that an error occurred. So let's imagine here. We looked at something the other day where we said, okay, what if we had this set age occur? Okay, set age occur, and we, instead of printing an error here saying invalid age, we could do something a little bit different, where I could do something like this, where I could say throw new exception. Okay. So let's look at a little bit about what this means, okay? And I have to change this a little bit, but what this is doing is we are saying, hey, we want to indicate that an error happened, and we want to throw this outside of this function. I'm going to trace it. It's a little easier to explain what's going on here if I trace the code line by line. Okay, first let's look at the error that comes up. Okay, right now I can't just write throw new exception. The IDE, right, is giving me a nice message, very helpful, and says one way of fixing this. And by the way, you have to always look at these and see if they make sense. In this case, it does, right? Sometimes the suggestions are kind of not helpful, but a lot of times they are, especially for common things. And what this is saying is I have to add something called throws exception. Throws exception here. Okay. Well, let me talk about a little bit about what this looks like. Let's go back here. Let's ignore all the file stuff for a moment, okay? Let's look at this here, set age, down below. So what we're doing, we've created this student Adam, right? So this object Adam, and we're setting the age here, okay, to 20. And now, there wasn't an error there before, but now if I look over and I hover my mouse, it says unreported exception must be caught or declared to be thrown. Okay. Now we saw this error before. We actually saw this with the file not found exception above. We actually saw the same suggestion that there's some sort of problem, and that it kind of said we have to do one of two things. Okay. One of the options is to do something like this, right? Just like we saw before, we can catch exceptions, right? So I could do that, right? And the reason this error didn't come up before is I didn't have this, right? We weren't throwing anything. So what is effectively is happening is the code runs. If it hits this line, right, it says, well, there's a runtime error. And it throws the error back. It says throw it out, like leave the function, immediately quit, right? And say, hey, and report back to whatever called the function and say, hey, we have an error. We have some sort of exception, right? And then whatever called it can handle how the logic however it would like, right? In this case, we're just printing a stupid little message, right? Okay. So how do we want to let's run this, right? So like right now, this would never happen. It's not an invalid age. Let me say if I try to set the age to -5, right? And let's trace what's going to occur here. I'm going to put a breakpoint there, and I also want another one here. Okay. So let me run this in debug mode. Okay. And okay, so we're here, we're in this try block, we're trying to set the age to 5. Okay. I'm going to go here, right? Now it's going to say is age less than 0. It is. It hits the throw new exception. Okay. And then we're going to hit this try block, this catch block, and it's going to report the error, invalid age set. Okay. And then we didn't return or quit. We just could keep going, right? You could if you wanted to. It's just whatever logic you want to have in there that seems to make sense depending on what you're building. Okay. Now, what am I getting at, right? Is I'm getting at the fact that there's different ways of handling errors, right? Or dealing with errors. Error handling is one is you try something, and if it fails, you catch the error. The other is you kind of punt, and you say, hey, I have an error here, and you throw it back to whatever was called, right? Whatever called it. So another way of getting this to run here is I could have also done this. Okay. We put this back, right? Notice it says, okay, hey, this isn't going to compile. Another option here, okay, is instead of saying, hey, surround with a try catch block, is I could say add throws clause. And what that does is when I selected that, is it literally added that here and said, hey, there's an exception that could occur in this main function that's not caught, and it just throws it. If it happens, it just throws it back. Okay, it just says, hey, some sort of exception occurred. It was never caught. It was never handled, inside the logic here, and we're gonna throw it back to whatever might have called this. Okay. So you have different ways of doing it. You can basically, what you're able to do is you're saying, hey, and try to do something and then handle the problem, catch it and handle it right when it comes up. So one is like kind of doing it right away and saying, hey, the problem occurred. Let's handle it now. The other is to say, oh, I don't want to handle it. I want to throw this back and let whatever called this function handle it, right? They are both exceptionally important to do, right? It's more of a design decision of what makes the most sense, right? Sometimes it's really important to throw it back to what called it because you want to the logic makes a lot more sense to handle, right? And you can have different pieces of code that are using a function that want to handle the problems in different ways. Okay. All right. So that's kind of the crash course introduction to exception handling or error handling in Java. I don't expect you to be an expert on it in one video, but what I do expect is that you have now a good understanding of the basics and the fundamentals behind like try and catch and throws, and that gives us a foundation that we can build upon at a later point. But the foundation is the most important. Once you have the foundation, you can get better about applying it in practice as we kind of move forward. Okay, so very powerful, right? Just a little side note before we wrap things up is that this type of error handling, exception handling, is extraordinarily important in real systems. Okay, when you're talking about engineering, and it could be engineering, I'm including in that software engineering, which this is a part of, is it's extremely important that you're building systems that are considered robust. And what I mean by that is you don't want systems to fail, right? You don't want a self-driving car or something to have a problem occur and it's just totally gives up and just flares out and doesn't try to recover from it. Okay, maybe an extreme example. So it's really important in real world scenarios that problems are handled in a reasonable way, an appropriate way, and you just don't have things failing and crashing all the time. And this is a big part of ways in which we can kind of have some tools in place for handling that. Okay. All right. So I'll stop. I don't want to ramble, but feel free, and I'd recommend, hey, watch this multiple times. And be safe, everyone. And I look forward to seeing what you're able to do with this as we move forward in the semester. All right, take care.